Welcome to the Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship Online Learning Education module. This module is based on our practice support tool, Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship, that is located on our website. In this module, we will review the nurse-client relationship, professional boundaries, abuse and neglect, over and under involvement, decision-making framework to assist in determining if nurses should engage in or abstain from a behavior, sexual misconduct, relationships with clients, nurses in a dual role, principles to protect the therapeutic nurse-client relationship, and conclude with key points. The Nova Scotia College of Nursing mandate is to serve and protect the public interest, preserve the integrity of the nursing profession, maintain public confidence in the ability of the nursing profession to regulate itself, and to set and monitor standards for the profession. There are approximately 15,000 nurses registered with NSCN that provide nursing services to Nova Scotians. This includes licensed practical nurses, registered nurses, and nurse practitioners. Understanding the therapeutic nurse-client relationship and the impacts of this relationship to the effectiveness of the nursing process is crucial. The therapeutic nurse-client relationship is at the core of nursing. These relationships are purposeful and goal-directed between a nurse and a client that protects the client's best interests and meets the client's needs. This relationship is based on trust, respect, protecting clients' dignity, autonomy, and privacy. Nurses hold a position of power by virtue of having professional knowledge and skills that the client relies on, having access to the client's personal health information, and being in a position of authority. As a result, nurses need to be cautious not to violate professional boundaries. The therapeutic nurse-client relationship has 5 common qualities. The first one is trust. Nurses are trusted to act in the best interests of their clients and provide them with safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical care. The second is respect. Nurses recognize and value the intrinsic worth of each person and treat them with respect. Thirdly, professional intimacy. Nursing practice by its very nature can create an atmosphere of physical, emotional, and psychological intimacy, which can increase the vulnerability of clients. In the therapeutic nurse-client relationship, professional intimacy is therapeutic, time-limited, and client-focused. Fourth, fiduciary duty. Nurses are required to put aside their own needs, act in the best interests of their clients, and avoid conflicts of interest. Nurses must be aware of their own behavior, values, emotional needs, and how their needs are separate from those of their clients. And fifth, power. The therapeutic nurse-client relationship is one of unequal power. This results from the client's dependence on the services provided by nurses due to the nurse's unique knowledge and authority within the healthcare system, their access to confidential information about clients, and their ability to influence decisions. This power imbalance places clients in a position of vulnerability. Nurses are responsible to recognize the imbalance of power and to be aware of the potential for clients to feel intimidated or dependent. A therapeutic nurse-client relationship never includes any form of sexual behavior. This table highlights the differences between therapeutic nurse-client relationships and personal relationships. The table can be found on page 3 of the Professional Boundaries document. You can see in the table that the left column provides examples of characteristics, the middle column outlines the therapeutic nurse-client relationship, and the third column outlines the dynamics of a personal relationship. For example, behavior in a therapeutic nurse-client relationship is regulated by a code of ethics and professional standards, while in a personal relationship, behavior is guided by personal values and beliefs. Unlike the therapeutic nurse-client relationship where the focus is meeting the needs of the client, a personal relationship focuses on the interests or pleasures of all individuals involved. Personal relationships can be online or in person. They may be sexual, casual and friendly, or serious and significant. Individuals involved in personal relationships set the parameters of the relationship and are equally responsible for maintaining the relationship. Professional boundaries are the defining lines which separate the professional, therapeutic behavior of a nurse from any behavior which, well-intentioned or not, could harm or could reduce the benefit of nursing care. Within the therapeutic nurse-client relationship, nurses are required to maintain professional boundaries at all times to ensure the therapeutic nurse-client relationship is safe and respected, regardless of the context or the length of the interaction. When a nurse departs from the limits of a therapeutic nurse-client relationship, intentionally or otherwise, it can result in a boundary crossing or a boundary violation. Given the power differential in the therapeutic nurse-client relationship, the duty to maintain professional boundaries always lies with the nurse and not the client. Professional boundaries are the space between the nurse's power and the client's vulnerability. Boundary crossings are brief excursions across professional lines of behavior made while attempting to meet a client's therapeutic need. Boundary crossings may be inadvertent or purposeful. However, even when the action or behavior may appear to be appropriate, it is not acceptable if it benefits the nurse and not the client. While boundary crossings may seem to be insignificant in a single instance, there is the potential for them to become boundary violations if the frequency or severity of crossings increases. Examples of actions or behaviors with current, former, or vulnerable former clients that have the potential to cross the boundaries of a therapeutic nurse-client relationship include establishing a personal relationship with clients, use of social media with clients, self-disclosure to clients, accepting gifts from clients, giving gifts to clients, doing favors for a client that are outside of one's job, providing care beyond one's job, and providing care to family and friends. Appendix A, recommendations to define and maintain professional boundaries in the Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship document that we have been referencing throughout this module, has further information that you may find helpful. Boundary violations are defined as a breach of trust in the nurse-client relationship. Boundary violations occur when a nurse's actions exploit the professional relationship to meet their own personal need at the expense of the client. Boundary violations are serious and often result in licensing sanctions. Violations can result when there is confusion between the role of the nurse and the needs of the client. Boundary violations are never acceptable. Examples of boundary violations with a current or former vulnerable client includes engaging in a romantic or sexual relationship, excessive self-disclosure about the nurse's personal situation, borrowing or attempting to borrow money, accepting a gift of money of significant value, giving a gift and expecting a favor in return, influencing a client to write or change their will or power of attorney so the nurse will benefit, becoming emotionally involved in the client's personal relationships, selling products to clients that promote the nurse's personal business, and a reversal of roles where the client becomes the caregiver of the nurse. Appendix B, titled Are You a Colleague? Crossing Professional Boundaries with a Client, found in the Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship document that we have been referencing throughout this module, contains further information that you may find helpful. Over the next 4 slides, we will discuss the definition of abuse and neglect, as well as the nurse's legal duty to report those events. Abuse and neglect are examples of extreme boundary violations. Abuse is the misuse of power or a betrayal of trust, respect, or intimacy between nurses and the client in which the nurse knows it may or reasonably be expected to cause physical or emotional harm to a client. Abuse may be verbal, emotional, physical, sexual, and financial, or it may take the form of neglect. The intent of the nurse does not justify a misuse of power within the nurse-client relationship. It may be helpful to review Appendix C in the Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship document to read the list of specific examples of abuse. Neglect occurs when nurses fail to meet the basic needs of clients who are unable to meet their needs themselves. Neglect can also occur through inappropriate activities such as withholding communication, confinement, isolation, ignoring or denying a client's care or privileges. It may be helpful to review Appendix C in the Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship document to read the list of specific examples of neglect. Nurses in Nova Scotia have a legal duty to report abuse and neglect to NSCN if it is a nurse, to an appropriate regulatory body if it is another healthcare professional, to an employer if the provider is an unregulated care provider, and to the Department of Health and Wellness or Community Services as required by provincial legislation. In the previous 2 slides, we reviewed examples of abuse and neglect. To recap, abuse may be verbal, emotional, physical, sexual, and financial, or take the form of neglect. Neglect can occur through inappropriate activities such as withholding communication, confinement, isolation, ignoring, or denying a client's care or privileges. For a more complete list of examples, please refer to Appendix C, Abusive Behaviors, in the Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship document that we have been referring to in this module. Over-involvement and under-involvement can become a boundary crossing, extend to a boundary violation, and be considered abuse or neglect. Every nurse-client relationship is conceptualized on the continuum of professional behavior. There are no definite lines separating the therapeutic relationship from under-involvement or over-involvement. Instead, it is a gradual continuum. This continuum provides a frame of reference to assist nurses in evaluating their own and their colleagues' interactions and movements with clients from a therapeutic relationship to one in which there is over-involvement or under-involvement. You may be asking yourself, what does over-involvement mean to my practice? Over-involvement refers to the unnecessary focus on the client. This excludes instances when a client's needs are higher than other clients because of increased complexity. Over-involvement can affect the recovery of other clients. For instance, when a nurse spends more time with one client than others, the neglected clients may feel their health is not important to the nurse, which may cause them to refrain from seeking assistance from the nurse or others. Developing a personal relationship is clearly over-involvement and can result in a breach of trust. For instance, a client who has developed a personal friendship with a nurse beyond the therapeutic relationship may fear judgment or a lack of confidentiality if they speak freely about their health. As a result, the client may withhold information from the nurse or others. Over-involvement includes both boundary crossings and boundary violations. Over-involvement with clients can be problematic, particularly with a vulnerable former client. These clients would be an individual who is no longer a current client and who requires particular protection from sexual misconduct, given their ongoing vulnerability. Signs of over-involvement with a current or vulnerable former client include giving personal contact information to the client, communicating electronically with the client through social media for personal reasons, giving gifts to the client, paying special attention to the client, such as spending time with the client outside their shift or on a break, discussing personal issues, frequently thinking about the client in a personal way as opposed to being concerned about the client's progress, feeling other members of the team do not understand the client or can help the client, engaging in behaviors that could reasonably be interpreted as sexual in nature, keeping secrets with or for the client, changing current client assignments to care for or ensure contact with the client, spending more time than is necessary with the client, speaking poorly about colleagues or your employment setting with the client, showing favoritism, meeting the client in settings other than care area or when you are not at work, paying for the client's medications, and driving the client places. As we discussed in the over-involvement slide, you may also be asking yourself, what does under-involvement mean to my practice? When a nurse avoids a client, they are under-involved in the client's care, which damages the therapeutic nurse-client relationship and causes repercussions for a client's health and well-being. Avoiding client interactions can occur when a client exhibits undesirable behavior. In cases of under-involvement, the nurse-client relationship can be affected on two levels. First, by avoiding a client, a nurse may just focus on the task associated with performing minimal care rather than dealing with issues that are making the client feel uncomfortable, such as exhibiting the undesirable behaviors. When a nurse avoids a client, they are putting their own needs ahead of the client's needs. Secondly, avoidance can raise the potential for substandard care. For example, the nurse failing to recognize physical or psychosocial needs that should be addressed. It is important to understand that avoidance can lead to neglect, which is a boundary violation. The lines between a boundary crossing and violation may not always be clear to the nurse. This decision-making framework can assist a nurse in determining if they should engage in or abstain from a behavior. The practice consultants at NSCN are always available to discuss any questions related to professional boundaries that you may have related to your practice. As you can see in this framework, on the left-hand side are proposed behaviors and questions to ask yourself, including, is the behavior consistent with the standards of practice and code of ethics? Does the behavior meet a clearly defined therapeutic need in the client's plan of care? Is the behavior consistent with the role of the nurse in this setting? And is this a behavior you would want others to know you have engaged in with the client? If you are answering yes to these questions, then you can proceed with the behavior and document it. If you are answering no to any of these questions, abstain from the behavior. Remember to consult with the healthcare team, your manager, and/or NSCN to determine how to address the client's needs if you are uncertain. Sexual misconduct is sexually demeaning, or seductive behavior that is physical, verbal, or nonverbal, made in person or through written or electronic means by a nurse towards a current client, former client, vulnerable former client, or towards a colleague who does not consent. Sexual misconduct by a nurse towards a client violates professional boundaries and constitutes professional misconduct. Professional misconduct is conduct or acts relevant to the profession that, having regard to all the circumstances, would reasonably be regarded as disgraceful, dishonorable, or unprofessional. Nurses' accountabilities related to sexual misconduct includes: nurses must not engage in sexual misconduct. Nurses must never engage in any form of sexual behavior with a current client. Nurses considering engaging in any sexual behavior with a former client must consider all the former client's circumstances. Failure to appropriately do so may result in a finding of professional misconduct or conduct unbecoming the profession. Nurses must never engage in any form of sexual behavior with a vulnerable former client. A current or vulnerable former client's consent is not a defense to an allegation of sexual misconduct. Nurses are required to report sexual misconduct if they have reasonable grounds to suspect that the conduct of a regulated healthcare professional or an unregulated care provider constitutes sexual misconduct. Please see the Sexual Misconduct Standard of Practice for Nurses for further information about sexual misconduct. Nurses must never engage in a personal relationship or any form of sexual behavior with a current client. An individual is considered a current client when a nurse-client relationship has been formed and is ongoing. To determine if a nurse-client relationship has been formed, consider the following factors. Has the nurse provided a nursing service for the client? Has the nurse contributed to or reviewed or accessed a health record or file of the client? Has the client consented to a nursing service provided by the nurse? As well as other factors relevant to the circumstances of the individual and the nurse. A nurse-client relationship may exist where one of the above factors is met or when a combination of factors is met. A client may no longer be considered a current client if care was provided in an episodic setting, such as a visit to the emergency department for a fracture or for an assessment at a walk-in clinic. Establishing a personal relationship with a former client can be complex. It can be especially challenging if it is formed shortly after the termination of the professional relationship because of the difficulties in determining if the relationship began while the client was still receiving care from the nurse. Nurses must never engage in a personal relationship or any form of sexual behavior with a vulnerable former client. Remember, a vulnerable former client is an individual who is no longer a current client and who requires particular protection from sexual misconduct given their ongoing vulnerability. If the nurse-client relationship was predominantly psychotherapeutic care, the client will always be considered a vulnerable former client. This includes but is not limited to mental health, addictions, and chronic care. For other individuals, their circumstances may change such that they no longer are considered a vulnerable former client. Homelessness, financial insecurity, and unemployed are some examples. It is important to consider if a former client is in fact a former vulnerable client. Factors that may increase the likelihood that a former client is actually a former vulnerable client include the nature of the care provided, the type, intensity, and duration of the nursing care, as well as the likelihood of requiring nursing care from the nurse in the future. In addition, the client's impaired decision-making ability, their age and maturity, and other factors relevant to the client's circumstances. Nurses considering engaging in a personal relationship or any sexual behavior with a former client must determine whether a relationship is appropriate after reviewing the following factors: the ongoing risk to the former client, risk of a continuing power imbalance, length of time that has passed since the last clinical or professional encounter. The exact length of time cannot be defined as it may be based on factors relevant to each former client's circumstances, as well as the nature of the care provided. So again, the type, intensity, and duration of that nursing care, as well as the likelihood of requiring nursing care from the nurse in the future. In addition, the extent of the personal health information accessible by the nurse, vulnerability of the client, maturity of the client, and the client's decision-making ability. Any nurse thinking about engaging in a personal relationship or any sexual behavior with a former client is advised to seek guidance from their employer or a consultant at NSCN prior to initiating the relationship. Given the power imbalance in the nurse-client relationship, there will always be a degree of vulnerability that exists for the former client. As a nurse, you may find yourself in a dual role. This is defined as a situation where, as a nurse, you may be required to provide professional care to a client who is also a family member or a friend. Dual roles are more likely to happen in small communities in the home, a hospital, or in any other healthcare context. The best course of action in this situation is to make every effort to transfer the care of the family member or friend to another appropriate care provider. If this is not possible, the nurse should set very clear boundaries with the client to make sure they understand that even though the nurse is a family member or friend, they are providing care in their capacity as a professional nurse. As well as disclose this potential conflict to the manager, and refrain from using your power as a nurse to gain access to more information than is required to provide safe care. The therapeutic nurse-client relationship is complex, and maintaining professional boundaries can be challenging. Nurses must continually reflect on their behavior to ensure their practice is consistent with their standards of practice and code of ethics and is within the boundaries that define the nurse-client relationship. It is important to remember these principles to help protect the relationship. The nurse is responsible to define and maintain boundaries. The nurse always acts in the best interest of the client. The nurse works within the therapeutic nurse-client relationship. The nurse should seek advice from their employer or from a practice consultant at NSCN when considering starting a personal relationship with a former client. And the nurse must never engage in personal relationships or any sexual behavior with current or vulnerable former clients. To conclude this module, we will leave you with some key points for consideration. The therapeutic nurse-client relationship is based on trust, respect, and protecting the client's dignity, autonomy, and privacy, irrespective of the context or duration of the relationship. Professional boundaries are the defining lines which separate the professional therapeutic behavior of a nurse from any behavior which, well-intentioned or not, could harm or could reduce the benefit of nursing care. Boundary violations are a breach of trust in the nurse-client relationship. Boundary violations occur when a nurse's actions exploit the professional relationship to meet their own personal needs at the expense of the client. Sexual misconduct by a nurse towards a client violates professional boundaries and constitutes professional misconduct. Nurses must never engage in a personal relationship or any form of sexual behavior with a current or vulnerable former client. Thank you for participating in this online learning education module, Professional Boundaries and the Nurse-Client Relationship. This document that has been used in the module can be found on our website. We encourage you to reach out to the practice team should you have any questions.